Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by the comment that startups are pretty on the outside, but oftentimes ugly on the inside?
If you know anyone who's had success in a startup, that's like your only thing you know is like they started really young, it worked really well, and they made a shit ton of money.
Welcome to another exciting edition of The Making of a Nobody. I'm Kyle Kane, your Chief Marketing Officer, and I'm crashing this week's episode as a guest host. And I apologize for anyone who was expecting someone maybe a little bit more easier on the eyes. Interestingly enough, I just received a text request actually to open up the show with a freestyle rap, but we're actually going to save that one for another day, because today we are going to take a closer look at the making of a nobody, a more literal sense through the lens of a lesser known and perhaps less popular perspective. What do I mean by that? Well, we all know there are many ways to become a nobody, right? And for those of you who are still catching up, you can take a quick look at nobodystudios.com/join. We'll take a look at the banner right there. But how is a nobody made? There's no right or wrong answer to this. But if you ask me, similar to how diamonds are made, it's a special recipe of ingredients under intense pressure. And so today in this live, unfiltered, unedited episode, I'll be speaking with none other than our Chief Nobody, Mark McNally. And today we'll challenge some comments. Mark talked about ugly startups. I have some questions about that. I also want to touch upon a couple of taboo subjects not typically heard in the business sense. And we'll wrap up with some stories that you won't find in ChatGPT and you won't be able to Google. So be sure to stick around for the end to hear that. So without further ado, let's bring on the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Mark Rally McNally. How are you, Mark? How you doing today?
Good, Kyle. How are you, sir? It's fun stuff.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat today in front of our crowd, 1,000 global investors across 55 countries and 6 continents, and of course our audiences on YouTube and LinkedIn. So let's dig right into it if you don't mind.
Of course.
On previous videos, I heard you discuss a lot of hot button topic issues that are of course important to our crowd, which include adaptability and optimization and scalability. We talk about AI and the progressive model and automation. And I want to start off by digging in a little bit deeper into your comment that I heard last week about startups. Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by the comment that startups are pretty on the outside, but oftentimes ugly on the inside?
Wow. Okay. Good question. I think it's what I intend by that comment is that if you know anyone who's had success in a startup, that's like your only thing you know is like they started really young, it worked really well, and they made a shit ton of money. And that's what it looks like on the outside, right? And we're all excited about watching like a Instagram or a Snapchat or a Tesla or a SpaceX. Like those are things that are really exciting to like watch and say, that's what I want to be a part of, right? I think people don't understand there's a few things. First of all, startups do this. They do these like peaks and valleys. And when you get a part of those things, it's consequential to your own outcome, right? There's people who are part of Google right now who haven't seen a big transformational impact on their wealth, right? Like there's a spot where the company is worth this and it goes, sorry, my camera right, and it goes to this, right? People need to understand where they're getting into that spot. But I think what's most important is like, I think on the outside, people just see like, wow, really cool, big idea, made a bunch of money. And what I always tell people is like, it's pretty on the outside if you think of like the press release. Started here and it went really big, right? The reality is that there's a lot of twists and turns, and there's politics, and there's pivots, and there's arguments, and there's fear, and there's doubts, and there's God knows too many times where you don't have the money you need, and you're the last moment before an investor comes through, and like I can't think of a single company that I know of that's gone any success whatsoever that didn't have that.
Ditto.
And people are like, well, great, but that's different for like a Tesla or a Instagram or a Facebook. It's like, no, not at all. Like I remember Tesla was, they had this very small little rocket ship, little car zooting around the, Silicon Valley in 2005, but they were bankrupt almost. In 2008, gave them $600 million in bailout money that Chrysler and GM and other people got. And that gave them their springboard into one of the most valuable companies in the platform in the world. So I don't know. I just think that it always looks really beautiful on the outside, but you have to appreciate that when you get under the hood, it's always ugly, but I say ugly with the most affection. And I say this to people who think they're here for the ride and it's supposed to look pretty on the inside. I'm like, no, we're trying to build the good outcome. We had this crazy, gnarly goal, and we actually got to a great outcome. That is the story we're trying to paint. But this is the internal workings. This is the movie we're going to make later. Is under the hood.
Right.
It's okay for it to be ugly. It's okay for there be, tough choices and big arguments and massive failures and pivots, and it's not okay. It's actually guaranteed to be a part of the journey.
Right. And similar to the human journey, right? I mean, we need to be prepared for those bumps in the road, those ebb and flows. It never goes as perfect. So, and is there a way for us as entrepreneurs to get a look at that? I mean, it almost seems like you have to go through it to understand it. I mean, what any advice for anyone looking to get a taste of it to see if this is something that they're cut for?
Great question. One, I think it's really easy, a lot easier if you're building a journey with people who kind of have that understanding, right?
Right.
But some of the best talents are still people who are very young that don't have that experience, right? I try to say what I'm saying now to those folks in the very front end. And I do believe there's something you can detect early on of whether or not someone's like, I'm really intrigued by this and I would love to be a part of this kind of journey versus this is in my makeup. One of the things I've determined in 24 for me is I'm going to be very more rapid in my assessments and my feedback, and also my ability to cut off relationships or deals that are not working. Right.
Yeah.
It also means that if you have that mentality, then you're also going to be very direct in the front end. This is what's going to be right for you. Right. And so I think that maybe a roundabout way to answer your question is if people are armed to know, like, if this is for you, then we'll know in like 5 months or 3 months or 2 months. Let's go do this. Let's go do it. Like, there's no surprises. Like, there's gonna be 900 twists and turns and challenges along the way. Like, we should know by working together. This is really not that the journey is easy, but working together should be easier, right?
Yeah.
Saying, oh, that sucked. How do we break that apart? How do we solve that? Okay, great. Solve that problem next. It's a distinctly different kind of mentality, right?
Yeah. And it sounds like it is tough to really know what it feels like without going through it yourself. And, so being surrounded by folks that are like-minded and forward thinking, or folks that are willing to take risks, I think that's the best way. So I love the way you talk about that. And I think, us as leaders, we use the term leaders sparingly or carefully, not sparingly, but carefully. And one of the things that attracts me to you as a leader is sort of the way you talk about that. And I heard you say something in the last interview. I've heard you say this quite a few times in the studio, is talking about the energy behind a team or the energy behind an idea or a particular person. And that's something that rarely you will hear a CEO talk about. And there's probably a few reasons for that. I mean, it's hard to quantify. It's hard to communicate when you have, a gut feeling about something. And so you mentioned, some accelerators and some anchors. And so just in terms of the context of energetics, I just wanted to learn a little bit more from you about, how you quantify energetics, how you listen to your gut, how you communicate that decision-making to your board and to other leaderships. How does that work in your life as an entrepreneur?
At a high level, energetics is like go where the flow is. You can paint a big picture and a big, broad vision, and you watch people that are attracted to the journey, but it's different when people are really making it easy, right? Some people might be like, I want to work for you, but this is my terms. These are my negotiation terms and my contract terms. And other people are like, I just want to jump in and help you, right? you tend to go, especially at startup, is like so much risk and there's so much unknown that you kind of just, you need to be with people who are flowing with you overall, right?
Mhm.
Like, not saying flowing with like buying your bullshit. I mean more like it's just, this is already a hard thing we do. So you're not attracted to people who make it harder. You're
Right.
attracted to people
That's
who
true.
make it easier, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think energetics is on the super high level is just flow of what do we do for a living, right? And then there's energetics, and in terms of like certainly been a part of my last 4 or 5 years of my life, highly tuned to where people are at, and I'm a very non-judgmental. Try to be very non-judgmental, but I understand where people are at, and I understand where they can play a role in my journey, or vice versa, right? And so it's looking for that flow. Are we energetically aligned? Which means, can you play a role in this journey, or vice versa? And sometimes you find people who are very like wrapped up in a ball of energy and negativity, and like, this is life, right? People are like brilliant, but they're going through a divorce, or they're, brilliant, but they're hung up on this, legal case they had 10 years ago. Like, none of that's wrong. It's all part of the human journey. But
Yeah.
are they hitting us at this right moment, or vice versa? Because I think when you find that vein, you suddenly take something that's already really hard to do and you make it less hard to do. And so I'm very keen to the energetics. And I used to think, this is the way I was trained, this is like 20 years ago, thinking that success had a lot to do with people's backgrounds and their training. And I actually think it has a lot more to do with where people are at their current point in their lives, and kind of bringing that together at one point. And I know you have a music background, but it's almost like that. Like, there's certain times a band rocks for fucking 8 years and they suck for 12 because they're in the wrong spots, right?
Right. Yeah, that's actually a great point. I mean, that reminds me of one of the mistakes that I made as a marketer in the crowd fund is, I was looking at people that had, finance degrees and 20 years of assets under management. I was looking at them as seasoned investors, and I was looking at someone fresh out of school with no finance education. I was looking at them as the newbies. And what I learned is that it's not about where they are in the traditional sense of their professional journey. It's about where they are in their entrepreneurial life cycle as a venture investor. Someone fresh out of school, even though they don't have 20 years in finance, they're going to get what we're doing easier than someone who has more of a traditional sense in a lot of cases. So very, very interesting that parallel exists. The one part I definitely agree with you on is the momentum and the feeling of the energetics in that sense. But one part that struck me is, when you mentioned that folks that make the journey easier because it's already hard. But on the same hand, as we attract diversity, we look for people that challenge us on the same hand. So it's like, so I'm just wondering, like, when you say, this is, I feel like an energetic anchor. To me, that, like the negativity and things that people that throw roadblocks in front of you instead of solutions, that makes perfect sense. But how do we maybe put some language around quantifying what an energetic accelerator would look like? Something where it really just fits, and like you said, it flows. Like, can you describe something like that, or a time when you felt like you had, like, this is an energetic accelerator, let's move quick on this?
Yeah, no, I think it's the absence of the anchors is a big part of it, right?
Okay, there you go.
It's really this, like, it's a deep appreciation of, like, at least for me, I can tell you from my leadership style, like, I have a complete awareness of everything that's going to hold us back. Nobody's going to bring something up that's going to shock me. I'm gonna be like, yeah, I've been thinking about that for like 10 years, right? So when people can meet me there and say, great, we know that, but, and a great example is actually our CFO, Greg Lovett, who I love to give him kudos. He's one of the best hires we've made in the studio and probably my entire career. But right before we hired him, we were on the last stages of another CFO, like 4 months interview process, multiple dinners, a lot of good relationships. And he's a very competent person and someone who's still in our circle today. But the language every step of the way would be, some of the problems you guys are going to have would be this. Some of the things that we're going to have to answer would be this. Some of the challenges you're going to have is this. And it always felt really weird because he's a very, very important role, right? CFO is like right hand to me, right? The fact that the word language was, and I didn't understand it at the moment, but it was more like, here's the things that are in your way. And I realized it didn't feel right. And I decided to move away from that conversation. And it was a serendipitous moment, which we've had like 9,000 in this Nobody Studio journey.
Right.
But it was one where I called somebody I thought I could just whine to. But I also knew he had a great relationship, network in SoCal. And I'm like, I need to find a CFO. Long story short, I was on a call with Greg Lovett within like 6 hours. And he had just left like a great situation, but had gone through an exit, and he was on the market, and he joined within like 3 days. But he's
Beautiful.
changed the entire trajectory of what we've been doing the last year and a half.
Yeah.
Why? Because he walked right in, the difference between the guy who was saying, here's what you're going to struggle with, was when I got done telling the vision of what we're going to accomplish, he's like, I think you're nuts. And I think I should probably be like studied for why I'm so excited about joining you, because this is what we need to do. And he started rattling off like the 400 things we need to solve for. Right.
Right.
So that's an energetic point that skill set wise, probably equal. I don't know. Maybe Greg's below, but energetically,
Way above.
levels above. And it's proved to be an amazing partnership since.
Yeah, that's a great story, and that reminds me of the topic of our episode today. So in that case, you went down to the goal line with another CFO, and that was a planned change based on the energetics. And in some cases, with the sports analogy, you've got teams that go all the way down to the goal line, they work their butts off to drive down the field, and then right before they score, they lose the ball to the other team, and they have to start all over. And that seems to be, the comfort with that process seems to be a common denominator in the successful entrepreneurs that I've studied. Is it's okay to fumble on the goal line, on the 1 and the 50, doesn't matter. And we've heard about some of the biggest fumbles from companies, right? I mean, we heard about the biggest record label in the world that said that the Beatles had no future in recorded music, or
Exactly.
Walt Disney was fired for lack of imagination. Oprah was fired for being unfit for TV, right? Steve Jobs was unceremoniously removed as head of Apple. And I've had my share of fumbles too as an entrepreneur, and I think we all have. And up until now, I've been hesitant to talk about them for whatever reason, whether it's something that I didn't want to repeat the cycle of, or something that I felt like would, damage my public perception. But the more that I grow into my entrepreneurial cycle and approach the stage of the give back, I realize that a lot of the people around me find value in me sharing these stories. So it's not about me boasting or bragging or protecting my ego. It's more about, what value can I provide to others? And so through these stories is how we provide value to each other. So I wanted to ask you candidly, tell me what your biggest fumble is, whether it's something you've been a part of or something you've witnessed. That I'd love to hear how somebody dropped the ball and it was just a big mess.
I think that there's these windows where you look back on time and say that was a big miss. So that's one thing for me, right? I can't think of any like massive crisis moments like in a point. But I can tell you that I can look back at moments in my career where like that was a massive miss. Even though at that moment I thought I was, the smartest guy in the room. I thought I had it figured out. And that's certainly turned into how I try to lead and think today, are these moments of like, wow, I really missed that moment. And, for me, I can say that like I was able to build B2B, e-commerce companies back when that was not a thing in like the late 90s and early 2000s. And I'm a big believer, you'll hear me talk about limiting beliefs quite a bit. Like I want to understand what your limiting beliefs are and how that translates into like you making more mistakes. And at that moment, I was leaving .com 1.0, which was build everything could be internet. There was a moment where like .com didn't exist. And so people were like, hey, we can do cars.com, and that makes sense. And pets.com. Okay, that makes sense. But there was like carwash.com. Like I'm going to click a button and someone's going to wash my car. Okay, maybe that can make some sense. But like everything was .com. You just added .com to everything, right? So I realized that I was really young in my career and had some success, but I wanted to go very distinctly the opposite direction, which was I wanted to figure out how to build things. So I built a platform to connect buyers and suppliers in the internet, which allowed me to do exactly what I wanted, like I needed in my soul. And I spent 8 years building, factories worldwide. It was a technology platform connecting buyers and suppliers, but I got a chance to see real stuff built and shipped and manufactured, and I could go all day long, right? My point being, my blinders that moment was that if I look at my original business model, I said I was going to do that, but I was going to turn it into an e-commerce website, which didn't really exist in 2003 and 4 when I started this. I didn't do that. I went very B2B focused, and I built a really great network of suppliers and buyers and customers. But I missed an opportunity to build one of the biggest companies that could have ever existed, which was connecting buyers and suppliers on an e-commerce platform. And some of those guys went on to do okay, Alibaba. There's a few companies that went on to, create, hundreds of billions of dollars. And I
Can
was
we get around this Thank you.
So I was right in the mix of it, and I built a company that I also thought was going to be really great, but I missed an opportunity that there's no one better to build what ended up should have been coming, what I was supposed to see. So
Right.
what I always tell the visionary, which is like they're so powerful, and yet we have to challenge ourselves. What are we not seeing?
Right.
Go ahead, Kyle. What's your biggest?
Like you, I've built about 30 plus brands, and every single one of them, there's been fumbles along the way. Every single one. If I had to pick the biggest fumble, it would have been with my last company. We started off in a small startup, shared office with 3 employees. And after work one day, I met the brand manager for Samsung. She explained to me they were getting crushed by Beats headphones. They were losing like 3% market share a month, and they were really doubling down on these new high quality headphones. They couldn't figure out a way to make it happen. And at the time, I had just come out of my VP role at Universal, and I had a good relationship with some artists. And so I learned about an artist, Katy Perry, who had an idea for a music video called Birthday, where she dresses up as all these different characters. And the label didn't want to pay for it because, all their money was spent on her face. So they didn't want her to cover her face and dress up as anyone else. So long story short, I connected the two. Samsung paid for the deal, and that was really all the money we needed and all the marketing we needed. We did the same thing for Katy Perry and Samsung that we did for Rihanna and Vita Coco, that we did for Kylie Jenner and Daniel Wellington. And at that point, we didn't have to do any marketing. We were ready to really focus on the monetization of our assets. So the opportunity came where Live Nation was selling the rights to Drake's big concert. He was the biggest artist in the world at the time. So we bought the rights to his concert at MetLife Stadium. And typically in the live events business, the first year event is a loss leader for a big second year. By the time the second year comes around, you've cultivated some community, you've proved the experience, and you have some sponsors now, and you have a handle on expenses and projections. So we invested a couple million, we got that right, and we sold out the tickets in 2 weeks. So we were about ready to collect about $6 million. We started spending all the ticket money on hosts and production expenses, and really doubling down on the guest experience. And I focused most of my time on risk mitigation. How do we get the money out of the building, certain intervals, and help to protect that money? What I didn't know was the biggest risk was a health risk, that Drake twisted his ankle. And he wrote a note to his fans here, as you can see here. He wrote a note saying that he was going to cancel these dates and everything was going to go back to normal for him in his holistic career as a songwriter. So with that, what I had to figure out to do was look into the contract, see the force majeure clause, and say, okay, well, we're okay. I called my attorney, and he said, let's refund all the tickets, so there's no class action suit. So at this point, we refunded all the money, and we were waiting for a refund for the purchase of the rights to the show. Well, the promoter was refunded the purchase, and the promoter disappeared. So for us to avoid the class action lawsuit, we had to borrow money. So it's, again, me and my 3 founders. We're trying to figure out, how do we get $6 million to refund ticket money? We borrow a bunch of money from a guy. I'll never forget it. It was late at night on a Hudson Street in New York City. Nice guy, handshake outside. 2 days later, we had the money in the account. I didn't ask many questions. Fast forward about 4 months later, we finished making the payments to the loan, and I get a phone call, and my partners get a phone call saying, hey, you missed some payments along the way. And we didn't miss any payments. Turns out this was an extortion scheme. It went as far as one of their partners running into my partner's house through the front door, put a gun in his mouth, and took all of his wife's jewelry. And that video was used for a grand jury testimony. And the guy was put in jail. Apparently, he was doing this to about 100 small business owners in New York City. So that was one of the most interesting stories of my career. We barely made it out. And I hope that most entrepreneurs don't have to go through something as drastic as that to learn these lessons. But the point is, there's no one way to make a nobody. And everyone is invited to pull up a seat at this table, no matter what kind of experience you bring. So I want to hit some questions from the crowd. Looks like we have a couple of comments. Let's see. Dave Schultz actually says something that's funny here. It's nice to see you two not in a smoke-filled room. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate that. We have Matthew Davidson here. Matthew talks about you can tell someone will flow with you, not always because of the answer someone provides, but because of the questions they ask. I see this as a practical way of challenging, practical way of challenging, but accelerating. Yeah, I like that, Dave. Very good. And Philip says, thanks, Kyle. Learned a lot from you and Mark, your journey, and appreciate you for your success. Well, thank you, gentlemen and ladies. It was a pleasure. Mark, any last closing comments for today?
Yeah, no, I appreciated the share that you did as well. And some of the comments that came through, like, I wish, I'd like to find an environment, to be honest, like make this better in the future. Like, I think the dialogue is the interaction would be really fun. So, I'll challenge you, Kyle, to think of, like, is there a T-Mone that's 40 minutes long and we just talk for 10 and interact back and forth, because I feel like that's I really always enjoy the feedback in the comments.
Yeah, me too. Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you for your time today, Mark. I think we all learned a lot.